Hello, everyone. This is Stephen Polgár. Um, a citizen speaks, and I have decided to put up another video. This time, it's going to be a series of videos um, because it's a subject of sort of a history, recollections. Um, I didn't want to call it an autobiography because I don't believe that we are really capable of presenting the stories of our recollections in a truly autobiographical manner. So it's a story, okay? The chief character's initial is S, and I'm going to call him that. And I hope you're interested. And if you are, would you please click the like button? And of course, if you subscribe, that will make it that much more worthwhile for me to be doing this. So, without further ado, let me get started. S had lived most of his 70 odd years in America, safer, freer, and more prosperous than 95% of the people on Earth. But his first 11 years were not as carefree or safe. In the summer of 1946, the chance of his birth brought him into the world in St. Stephen's Hospital in the bombed out city of Budapest, which by that time had managed to clear away most of the rubble and build one temporary bridge across the Danube to replace the 5 blown up by the retreating German armies in 1944. The structural and material devastation was a visual metaphor for the atrocities sustained by the population of the small Central European country. The Nazis had occupied it on March 19, 1944, imprisoned and killed thousands of their political opponents, and under Eichmann's supervision, rounded up and deported nearly 600,000 of Hungary's Jewish and 5,000 of its Gypsy citizens. Now, those numbers, please be careful. I'm not saying that those numbers are accurate. They're estimates. Nobody knows the exact number, even though the Germans were meticulous about keeping records. Still, there were many, many people that may have died and were not accounted for, and so on. So please don't take those numbers as very accurate. Since 1943, they had manipulated the mostly unwilling soldiers of Hungary's, meaning the Germans manipulated the mostly unwilling soldiers of Hungary's armies to accompany them on the Russian campaign. Nearly 1 million of them died in battle, were frozen to death, and many thousands became prisoners in the Soviet Gulag. S's immediate family contributed victims to the above numbers. His father, George's, or George in Hungarian, mother, Barbara, or Borbála in Hungarian, was taken to and murdered in the gas chamber of Auschwitz. Her husband, Stephen István, at the age of 62, approximately 62, was force-marched 160 miles across Hungary to the Austrian transit camp of Mauthausen near Linz, Austria. From there, he was taken to Gunskirchen, a camp built by the Nazis for the purpose of locking up and starving its Jewish inmates. István survived until liberation, but probably died of eating too much to alleviate his unimaginable hunger. The evidence of his survival was a postcard he sent to the Ottensheim home of the Austrian woman known to S as Tante or Aunt Clara, who had been his son's governess. S has a photograph of his mother and her brother Tomasz, or Thomas. He was 20 and she was 17. The picture is an affirmation of life in the best tradition of the portrait photographer's art. Brother and sister are the models of hope, youth, promise. There's not a hint of tragedy or even the slightest imperfection. He smiles handsomely, self confidently, gazing into the lens with the certainty of youth, impassioned, idealistic, like Paul Henri in Casablanca. She smiles too, happy, full of the joy of an intelligent, gifted young woman. The date of the photograph is 1943. Hungry by a series of lucky miracles, adroit diplomacy, flimflammery, in other words, of politicians had managed to keep the horrors of the war beyond its boundaries. Even by Nuremberg standards, half Jews like S's mother and her brother were safe. The total collapse, the loss of the least modicum of reason was still almost a year away. There are a few more pictures left of that last year of relative sanity, in which hundreds of thousands of Hungarian soldiers were already dying on the side of the doomed German military in the great expanses of Russia. Jews who could not demonstrate Hungarian citizenship had been brutally expelled into the maelstrom of Nazi-occupied Ukraine. Massacres had occurred in distant places. Reports were reaching Hungary about the brutality of Nazi concentration camps. The expression death camp had not yet become a term of common usage. Then in a short year, the health, youth, optimism of the pictures was shattered by the reality of life. Tomasz, still young, idealistic, and brave, was arrested by the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian Nazis, who took control of the country on the 19th of October, 1944. He was sent to a concentration camp, labor camp at Bissingen, outside of Frankfurt am Main in Germany. An unathletic college student, he was not strong enough to survive the thin meals and the incessant hard labor of relaying destroyed railroad tracks in winter. By Christmas 1944, he was sick with typhoid fever. Without medical attention, he wasted away and died on New Year's Eve, 1944. A day after he died, the papers arrived attesting to his qualifications as a chemist, which would have made it possible for him to work under less stringent and physically demanding circumstances. The last hours of his life, even the dramatic words he spoke on his deathbed, "Tell my mother I died for a better world," were recorded by Arthur Sedlička, who wrote to Paula, Tomasz's mother, from Slovakia. Better prepared for the privations and exertions of life at Bissingen, survived the camp and the war. That is a sample of the stories S. heard throughout his life from his mother and father and his grandmother Paula. There were many more involving his father's successful adventures in surviving Nazi and then communist attempts to deport him to concentration camps. The first pursued him because of his Jewish heritage, while the second were following orders to round up as many able-bodied men as they could for forced labor in various parts of Russia. These became the summaries of his immediate heritage. His mother's surviving parents, Paula and Anton or Anthony, had their own stories of narrow escapes. Luckily for his eventual sanity, his mother and father recounted some of their pleasant memories before the onset of Nazi and communist rule. One of S's favorites was about the 5-year-old Tomasz taking a walk on the Pest bank of the Danube with his father Antal. They ran into Paula's friend Matilda, who, after praising Tomasz, began to treat him to a few of her admonitions. "Tomasz, you must be a good boy. and listen to your parents. Always ask them for permission before you say or do anything. Tomasz pulled on his father's sleeve to get his attention and asked, Dad, may I kick Aunt Matilda's leg? His mother's stories were often about their summer vacations on the outskirts of Esztergom, the administrative seat of the country's cardinal archbishop. S had spent many summers there as a child, had walked up unpaved roads near his great Aunt Irene's house where he and his sister stayed, had gone to the village of St. George's Meadow, with Uncle Imre, Irene's husband, who took him to the barber shop and afterwards to the wooden bowling alley behind the local tap room. He went to the large basilica on Sundays with Imre and sometimes with Irene. This 19th century oversized church had been built over a 14th century one designed by Italian architects, reflecting their more modest and focused perspectives. As a child, he was awed by the magnitude of the painting behind the altar depicting Mary's ascension into heaven and the tall marble columns that supported the structure, topped by a cupola. The most searing memory was of the hymn sung by the congregation at the end of the Mass. Its words and the melody stayed with him. Beatific woman, Holy Mother, our first, our greatest patron, we suffer from famine, we beseech you. Don't forget us Hungarians, don't forget Hungary. Each time he heard them, and later as they resounded in his mind, he felt the sobbing, starving people of his country seeking solace and succor. The pain, the disappointment, the sense of abandonment in the singing rose into the cupola, surging out over the church, spreading over the countryside, the rushing waters of the Danube, and the land beyond. He knew the locales of the stories like that megalomaniac church and could imagine his mother and his uncle there as children in their years of peace. One of his mother's stories about those summers in Esztergom was about how her brother Tomasz walked with her to the end of Körösi László Street to the house of her friend Kata or Kate, and on the way back showed her the house of Kempelen Farkas, better known to the outside world as Wolfgang von Kempelen, the 18th century inventor of the chess-playing Turk. Tomasz challenged his 6-year-old sister to remember the man's name when they reached home. The little girl had trouble when her brother spent the rest of the walk babbling. Kalampen, pelenken, kalapen, kimpelem, kilampen, kompolom. His father's stories were mostly of his school days, often about what children did or said in class. George was a raconteur, always ready with a joke or a funny story, in the tradition of defaulting to humor in the worst of circumstances. Like many of his countrymen, he responded to impossible threats, unimaginable misfortune, with this form of denial. The way people in more mundane circumstances laugh or giggle when attention is directed at their mistakes or lies. He even told us about how the men, aware that they were maybe transported any time to the Russian front, and unarmed, unprotected, be ordered to lay and remove landmines, told jokes in the work camp at Auschwitz, where he and his father were confined in 1944. Yes, the stories George told were funny. A few of these were about German class, a subject easy for George, but not so for at least one local boy, who had to repeat the phrase, Lohengrin ratata. Or in German it would be ratata, sorry. No rolling R's in German. Meaning Lohengrin road. Instead he said, Lohengrin Lohering ratata, which in slightly twisted Hungarian came out as horse's dung road, since herring combined with horse could only be interpreted this way in Hungarian. Another story about the same class related to what happened when the teacher wanted to demonstrate how good George's German was. The principal and the German language supervisor were visiting the class, and the teacher called on him. Knowing that since he had been raised with an Austrian governess, he spoke the language like a native. Things went smoothly as the teacher asked questions and George responded fluently and correctly in German. The trouble came when George had to answer a question about why the past participle, gegangen, of gehen, which means to go, had to be used in a sentence, and why an appropriate tense and number of the helping verb, sein, meaning to be, had to be used with it. George had no idea. He knew and was adept at using the language correctly, but he never learned the grammar. The teacher's demonstration thus turned into a fiasco, and George was no longer asked to show off his knowledge of the language. The impression of Esther's early years, which he retained vividly, were the faded browns and grays, the smells of cooking stews in apartment building hallways, and the varying shades of darkness. Wherever he went to the city with his parents, sister, and friends, he could see the damage left by the recent war. There were houses in downtown Budapest pockmarked by bullets and fragment holes. Large empty lots where apartments or office buildings had once stood were like missing tissue in the city's body. This included a lot next to the 7-story building in which they lived on József Attila Street. The space had been turned into a playground where he often played. He had memories of the sandlot in that little park facing Minute Alley, or Peretskurs. The communist ideology succeeded at least with the children. They knew that his father was a doctor and that he was bourgeois, or bourgeois in Hungarian. That was enough to brand him in the eyes of boys who played there. Most of them were working class kids. He was often attacked and fought with them. He remembered a gypsy boy about his size with whom his fight was not inconclusive. In others, with the bigger boys, he was beaten and chased off, so that after a while he was afraid to go there by himself. Once his grandmother Paula accompanied him, and her presence intimidated the little ruffians. After so many years, he could still see the darkness and feel the cold of winter evenings and nights. There was not enough coal to supply power in the city, so it was often cold in the 6th-floor apartment where they lived. There were winter evenings on which the family had to wear their coats, and his mother heated bricks in the oven to put into their beds before they climbed under the covers. The old street lights, some of which were gas-lit, burned weakly. After the clocks were set back in the fall and darkness fell by 5 in the evening, walking home from school meant passing through a lot of dark side streets. Because of the coal shortage, schools had a morning and evening shift, alternating for students from week to week. The morning classes were from 8 to 12:30, and the afternoon ones from 1 to 5:30. There are many other ways in which the country suffered the consequences of the war. Rebuilding proceeded at a slow pace, and most of the country's infrastructure, even when it was repaired, was at best in its pre-war condition. Ironically, the technical innovations of the interwar years were forced to serve much longer than originally intended. The capital's telephone system, one of the more advanced ones for the 30s, was not modernized, so that 40 years after the war was still substantially the same as when it had been installed. The communist-ruled government was efficient only when it came to policing and spying on the populace. When he was 8 years old and serving as an altar boy at the city's St. Stephen Basilica across the street from his school, S was initiated into the workings of the police state. The Bishop of Kolochov had his funeral at the central church, and one of the priests positioned S inside, looking out onto the square. There was a man standing out there looking at the basilica. The priest told him that this was a policeman and he should watch what the man was doing and let the priest know. If he changed his position or did anything else besides standing there and looking. S understood that the man was probably from the AVO, the State Protective Authority. What he could not have known then was how dangerous any interaction was with these secret policemen. Those are a few factual details of S's early life, but they say nothing about the spiritual development of the boy. He was physically healthy and strong for his size. He inherited a big blonde head from his ancestors and was lucky enough to have a brain capable of acquiring information and understanding subtle, sometimes well-hidden nuances. Maybe as a result of this perspicacity, he was a sensitive boy. The many stories of the suffering his parents and their families had lived through before his birth instilled in him a deep sense of right and wrong, of the significance of justice, and the sacrifices that men like his uncle Tomasz had made in its name. The result was that he came into conflict with his parents, the most immediate authorities in his life. He did not understand until many years later that his controlling father, George, relied on his reason and logic to overcome obstacles which had been the undoing of many of his friends and acquaintances, especially if they had been born into the wrong religious or ethnic minority. Though people of his father's time referred to race, S had come to reject this absurd term, especially after geneticists were able to identify the minimal differences that resulted in the categories political ideologues of the 19th and the early 20th century used to define races. His father's reliance on his ability to outsmart desperate situations that could have easily led to his demise did not serve his relationship with his wife and children who were seeking an emotional attachment. He had learned that survival required camouflaging emotion. S came to understand this when he was a young man and his father spent time with him recounting his experiences during the war. The detail that stayed with him, the one which S wrote down, was his father's last meeting with his mother. It was in June 1944, after the Germans had occupied Hungary and installed the pro-Nazi government under Prime Minister Duma Story. Adolf Eichmann was in Hungary supervising the deportation of Jews, Gypsies, and other enemies of the Third Reich. The government used the gendarmes to carry out the roundup, concentration, and loading onto cattle cars of 600,000 men, women, and children to transport them to Auschwitz. George was 25 and had managed to visit his mother, Borbála, Barbara, in what had been then their family home until the government expropriated the living and dining room portion of the house after a little more than an hour of the house. After a little more than an hour spent together, George said goodbye, not knowing that this was the last time in his life he would see his mother. She loved her only child unconditionally, proud of his successes as a man in this hostile world. He sought nothing from her that she wouldn't give, and he filled the spiritual need left unrequited by his fathers, who had drifted away from her many years ago. George didn't acknowledge to S his well-hidden pain, fossilized inside him by her loss. She was the woman closest, most emotionally reliable to him in his youth and early manhood. As he related to S, they spent a lot of time together, especially when George was on vacation from school and had developed an unusual friendship between a mother and son. Whatever spiritual undertones there were between them, tinged even by unconscious taboos, they reached a point that neither found at that time with another. Now the dark-haired, slim woman with the eyes belying a rich imagination, always tactfully and modestly dressed, waved goodbye to her slim, dark-haired doctor son, dressed in his pseudo-military uniform. She probably feared more than he and was aware of those fears, unlike the young man who was now ever more tightly wound and protective nonchalance. As he had said at various times to S, he had to hide his fear and uncertainty so that the human predators he encountered would not smell it the way animals do. He told S that he walked away from his mother and didn't turn back to look at her. S felt a terrible remorse that still weighed on his father's soul. Having an imagination more like his lowest grandmother, S compensated for the feeling his father suppressed by conjuring his own version of the unrevealed emotion. The moment of this revelation helped him grow closer to his father and to sympathize with the man who had caused him so much pain and trouble as a child. This moment of loss, unconfirmed until years later when George was told about the murder of his mother in the gas chamber at Auschwitz, was at most an unconscious premonition for the young doctor as he returned to the military work camp where he had been assigned with his Jewish compatriots. It formed into the horrifying story that haunted his son S for the rest of his life. His father, after years of incredible discipline to maintain his protective shield against those willing to send him to his death, could not dwell consciously on the details of his mother's murder. His punishment came in the form of sleepless nights, avoiding torturing dreams welling up from his unconscious. S could only imagine by analogy and exaggeration of his own most troubling ones what those may have been. What he couldn't imagine was how his father lived with such painful memories, how he overcame the terrifying and potentially debilitating effect of these to persevere and succeed in the 71 years after he had said goodbye to his mother. In the last of his father's 96 years, S saw how this legacy had crippled the old man. He struggled with sleep and was unable to find peace. The sleepless nights came back and aggravated his dementia, probably caused by years of similar nights, which he countered by the daily ingestion of sleeping pills. The habitual lack of mental and physical regeneration finally destroyed the thing the man had valued the most, his reason. As his father could express anger, mistrust, and skepticism, but was always careful to bury the opposites of these emotions, lest they betray him. His attitude extended to rearing his first son for a world which was filled with obstacles and traps and included few, if any, opportunities for success. Whether there were or would be any in the boy's future, he couldn't prepare him for those. He was only able to instill a requirement in the boy to struggle against the odds that were against him. Certainly for the first 10 years of the boy's life, when his prospects were limited to Hungary, dominated by a dictatorship based on lies which the rational doctor saw through, this strategy was an unfortunate requirement. If the boy was not going to become a victim of the thinly veiled evil of the socialist system designed to grind down the individual, he would have to develop resources like his father. These involved brains and ability to outsmart his competitors and opponents. There was no room for sentiment and intangible ideals. Brutal and mundane reality could only be conquered without emotions. The boy had to be taught cold, ruthless reason if he were to amount to anything. How right his father was became clear to S many years after he had left Hungary. On one of his visits made possible after the easing of travel restrictions in the late 60s, he met Shandor, a young man his age, who came from a similar background. He was the son of a friend of S's mother. Shandor was not accepted to study at any of Hungary's post-secondary institutions because of his religious and middle-class bourgeois background. He could not use his intellectual abilities, but was limited to physical or service work. He and his mother were unable to obtain passports since they were deemed unreliable that is, they would not have returned to the country once given the opportunity to leave it. There were many other examples of friends and acquaintances whose lives were constricted into the arbitrary cages of socialist-inspired uniformity inside which individuals struggled. They sensed that the unattainable was outside the cages, but knew that they could not reach for it unless the system that imposed the cages was broken. The system had been devised to prevent them from knowing how everyone else felt caged, and especially from providing them opportunities to share their frustrations and think of ways to break out of their cages. His father's concern with the survival of his family and himself meant some simplistic disregard of the fragility and weakness of a young boy. One of S.'s earliest memories of punishment reached back to when he was only 4 years old, or maybe a few months younger. He did something thoughtless that hurt his 2.5-year younger sister, and his father spanked him hard. That proved to be a common disciplinary method in the years of his childhood. Physical punishment of especially boys was an accepted form of discipline, and George used the method to corral the irrational child, especially when it came to his behavior in the outside world. For these early years, that meant school and his performance there. If S did not excel, he had no chance of achieving a position in society that required intellectual skills. Children of middle-class families in those years were only to be considered for advancement to college and further study if they were exceptional and came from trustworthy families. Since his father had made the choice of not joining the Communist Party, the one way to establish this epithet, he had greatly reduced as his chances of success. The only way to increase that was by pushing the boy to excel. Besides the corporal punishment for inadequate report cards, both of his parents worked with him at home to improve his school performance. In the 4th grade, when they determined that he was not doing as well in math as they expected, they arranged for him to have tutoring with one of his teachers. This turned out to be an excellent decision, since the lady taught S math in the one way which was effective. She approached the subject through riddles and games, introducing abstract concepts and steps that formed the basis of the subject through playful applications, which attracted the interest of the child and overcame his defenses against these abstractions. Luckily for S, there were moments with his father that countervailed his otherwise unaffectionate treatment. These included going up to Sobotchak Head, or Freedom Mountain, where his father worked and learning how to ski. As most things between father and son, these experiences were a mixture of pleasure and pain. The trip usually began with the two walking across Lancy, the chain bridge, across the Danube. Though too young to appreciate the view, at least unconsciously, the boy must have been affected. On a freezing Saturday morning, reflecting the rays of the sun, the ink-black river sparkled below them. It was almost 3/4 of a mile wide at that point, a great thoroughfare, with boats and ships plying its waters from Germany to the Black Sea. Its ominous depths were hidden by bigger waves chasing smaller ones as it crashed around the granite bridge piers below. The bright sunlight, besides mitigating the winter cold, lit up the old damaged city spreading out on either side of the river. Ahead of them, atop Varhead, or Castle Mount, rebuilt after many sieges, stood the ruins of the once ornate royal castle. And just north of it rose the Matthias Temple, Matthew's Church, also scarred and damaged in the war. Chain Bridge, two life-size statues of lions guarding its bridgeheads, reflecting its more than 100-year history, was the oldest connection between Buda and Pest. Carrying skis on his shoulder was not a new experience for S. It wasn't much trouble walking on the footpath across the bridge, but when they had to climb onto a trolley, the heavy wooden things and the dangling ski poles became a problem. George kept admonishing him to avoid other passengers. Since he carried his own skis, taking the boys might have been too hard, though remembering similar experiences with his own sons, S thought it more likely but even this, unpleasant as it was a lesson. That soured the memory, since the trepidation was unrelenting until they reached their destination. One excitement of these trips was taking Budapest cogwheel tram up to Freedom Hill. There was a lot to see, including views of the Buda Hills stretching up and down the west bank of the Danube, and the wide expanse of church steeples and rooftops of the west side, which crowded the other bank toward the plains on the eastward horizon. At one point, George pointed out a red-tiled roof villa that had been converted into a home for North Korean children, refugees from the war in that country. Once up on the hill, they walked up to a height away from the sanatorium where his father was one of the physicians treating children with tuberculosis. George led him to a small hill and showed him how to brake using the plow technique with the skis. He watched the boy make a few mistakes and attempts, and when he made it down without a spill, went off to ski down the slope by himself. S spent a lot of time down in the snow, but eventually figured out as much as an 8-year-old boy could about how to make it downhill without a fall. We'll call it day now. That's pretty long. First installment. If you're interested and would like to see more, please come back. Again, please hit the like button and remember to subscribe if you want to see more of this. I appreciate your support, and I continue to look forward to having you come back. Thank you, and bye-bye. Again, it's Steve Polgár, A Citizen Speaks.